Thank you. Yeah, so I'll talk to you about marine nature-based solutions, which are slightly different to the other chapters. Firstly, though, just to say, this is another collaborative chapter, and it's had a good number of people contribute, plus the reviewers as well. We've made some really good suggestions. So while I'm presenting this, it certainly isn't all my work, and plenty of people have contributed to this work. I guess with marine systems, there's actually a lot of different habitats within the marine realm, and different habitats and different species sort of do different things. So I'm going to run through those one by one, really, and then sort of show you some data on carbon sequestration rates across habitats and some issues as well. But I guess things like salt marsh and seagrass are probably the best established marine nature-based solutions. There's far more data on these habitats than there are on others, and we're far more certain of this data. And they work by, obviously they are photosynthetic in the main in terms of habitats, so they do capture carbon that way, but the real sort of benefit of them is they bury carbon in the sediment layers. So that means they will capture some of the sort of seagrass growth or some of the salt marsh plant growth within those sediments, but also they'll be capturing carbon from freshwater environments, particularly if they're in sort of estuarine areas, potentially from terrestrial processes as well. And they do have, obviously, things like salt marsh is particularly good at preventing sort of coastal erosion, can help with flooding, both from sea level rise and from sort of acting as a sort of buffer for floodplains and things like that. And the potential for restoring them is quite high. So restoring seagrass, we've lost a lot of seagrass over the last few decades. And through things like managed realignment, there is potential to have a lot more salt marsh within the UK. We've also got algae, whether that's phytoplankton or kelp or other macroalgae. And the kind of estimates are somewhere between about 50 to 70% of global photosynthesis occurs in the ocean. Absolutely the bulk of that through phytoplankton. What we do know is about 1 to 1.7% of that productivity of phytoplankton is actually sequestered, so mainly falling down into the deep sea marine sediments, and possibly about 5% of the productivity of algae. And this is very, very sort of emerging research, and we're quite unsure of these figures at the moment. But about 5% of the productivity of things like kelp may well be actually sequestered again in marine sediments, and some of that's found in the deep sea, some of that's found in more local sediments as well. So there's potential from things like from algae to act as a nature-based solution, but it's really research in its infancy at the moment. But again, they do have other benefits. So kelp helps prevent things like storm damage to coastlines, reduces the amount of wave action acting on coasts, and it's an incredibly biodiverse habitat as well, and it supports all sorts of things. And I'll give some more sort of economic values of kelp later on. Perhaps going even more speculative, but certainly something that's worth considering, is the role of marine fauna as well. Marine fauna has a great potential to affect carbon cycles in the ocean. And that's especially true if we look at this research on sort of the biomass of the biomass split in the oceans. So bearing in mind at least 50% of photosynthesis is occurring in oceans. If we have a look at this figure down here, we can see the difference in the biomass of producers between terrestrial and marine environments. And it's about 450 times more primary producers in terrestrial environments. And actually, it's quite an inverse sort of pyramid between producers and consumers in the sea. So actually, there's 5 times more animals than there are plants, essentially, which means that marine fauna could have a big role. And we know things like whales have often feed at the deep sea, and then they defecate up in the surface areas, and that creates a nutrient pump, essentially, which allows for algae to be more productive. We also know that big fish, again, through eating smaller fish and then defecating, can actually act as a sink of carbon into the sediments. And potentially, and there's been some more sort of focused research on this lately as well, that actually larger predatory fish actually reduce the amount of biomass of fish and potentially of phytoplankton in the ocean. And of course, all those animals are also respiring and producing carbon dioxide. So while we can't really put figures on the role of marine fauna, it's certainly an area that does need to be considered. If we have a look at comparisons of carbon sequestration between sediments, then what we can see probably in terms of carbon per hectare per year, salt marsh and seagrass are the biggest sort of nature-based solution for absorbing carbon. There's big error bars on here, and these represent the range of data that we've got. So this is the typical values for seagrass and salt marsh within the UK. Down at the lower end of these values, we're probably looking at newly restored areas or newly created areas. But within a few years, those values also begin to increase well up towards the average. So restoration is quite an effective strategy. If we look at things like continental shelf sediments, I'm having enough job saying sequestration, yet alone trying to put too many S's in. So while the amount per hectare looks quite low, of course, there are a lot of, there's a big area of sediment, and most of the marine environment, or at least the benthic marine environment, is essentially mud or sediments of some sort. And kelp, I haven't got any uncertainty estimates in there, but it is, you can see it has potential to be a nature-based solution for carbon capture, but it is quite uncertain at the moment. If we multiply that up by the area in the UK and just have a look at what's happening at the moment, well, potentially again, and there is uncertainty here, kelp could be a really important nature-based solution in terms of carbon capture. The sediments, the continental shelf sediments, are probably certainly store a lot of carbon, and salt marsh and seagrass become less important. But again, as I said before, there is a huge potential to actually to restore these habitats as well. So things like the sediments clearly need protection in place from things like trawling, from fishing and other disturbance effects, because if we disturb this sediment, then we can release the carbon back into the ocean, and then it can be used again, so it isn't necessarily locked up. And there's a huge amount of restoration potential or managed realignment potential for increasing the amount of salt marsh and seagrass within the UK. If we do compare between habitats as well, so not just between marine habitats, this is a figure that often gets bandied around quite a lot, that actually seagrasses can be 20 times better than tropical rainforest at sequestering carbon. And it's come from some studies that have really looked at carbon sequestration through burial of carbon in the soil, and or in the sediments in this case. And obviously the way that forest or tree or woodland carbon sequestration is looked at is very different. It also looks at the biomass of the trees as well, and how fast they grow and so on. So while the values for seagrasses are about equivalent, these probably aren't really representative of what we'll find in the final report. The values for woodland will be much higher. We need some further work to do all these sorts of things. So standardized values of carbon sequestration across habitat types so we can properly compare marine and non-marine. We need to have a better understanding of marine fauna and algae. We need to look at restoration methods and bring the costs down of those. We need to look at effective protection, whether that's increasing fish, reducing harmful fish, fishing methods like trawling. We also need to consider the overall benefits of nature-based solutions for the marine environment. For example, a study which has been done on the value of restoring kelp forest in West Sussex says there's probably about £1.2 million worth of benefits from restoring a relatively small area of kelp forest. And I think I'm more or less out of time, so I will stop there.
Thank you, Rick, for that marine perspective. A lot to think about there as well.